The ink on the contract wasn't even dry when Carter Vance realized something was wrong. He'd just walked out of the private office 2 floors below, his signature fresh beside the Miller family seal, sealing a truce that was supposed to end months of bloodless tension between 2 of Chicago's most careful syndicates. A marriage. Simple, cold, necessary. His bride was waiting for him upstairs, or she was supposed to be. Carter stepped off the private elevator into his penthouse suite, expecting to find Audrey Miller standing by the window in whatever ridiculous white gown her mother had picked out. Instead, the suite was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that made the hair on his arms stand up, because in his world, silence usually meant something had already gone very wrong. Then he saw her. Chloe Miller stood near the open balcony doors, the night wind pulling at her dark curls, an empty velvet ring box clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles had gone pale. She was Audrey's younger sister, the quiet one, the one nobody at the Miller table ever really looked at twice. Soft around the edges in a way her sister never was, dressed simply, like she hadn't expected to be seen tonight at all. "Where is she?" Carter said. It wasn't really a question. Chloe's chin lifted, but her voice shook when she finally spoke. "Audrey's gone." Carter's jaw tightened. He crossed the room slowly, the way a man moves when he's already calculating 3 different ways a night could end badly. "Gone where?" "I don't know. She left hours ago, before the signing even finished." Chloe swallowed hard. "She took something with her. Files, drives. I saw her packing them into a bag before she disappeared out the service exit." Something cold settled in Carter's chest. He knew exactly what files meant in this house. The master ledgers, the encrypted records that mapped every account, every shell company, every hidden vein of money that kept the Vance empire breathing. If those were gone, it wasn't a broken engagement anymore. It was a bomb with a lit fuse sitting somewhere in the city, and he had no idea who was holding the detonator. He studied Chloe for a long moment. She didn't cower, even though every instinct in the room told her she probably should have. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady, watching him the way someone watches a storm they can't outrun, bracing rather than begging. "You knew about this," he said quietly. "No." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "I swear I didn't. I found out an hour ago, same as everyone else probably will soon. I just—" She stopped, pressing her lips together like she was deciding whether trusting him with the rest of the sentence was a mistake. "I think I was supposed to be here when you found out. Not her." Carter went very still. It clicked into place with the kind of clarity that only made him angrier, not at her, but at the calculation behind this whole night. Audrey hadn't fled in a panic. She'd left her sister standing in a war zone on purpose, a soft target, someone easy to blame, easy to hurt, easy to sacrifice, while the real players slipped out the back door with everything that mattered. "Your father set this up," Carter said. Chloe's breath caught. For a second, something flickered across her face, not surprise, but the look of someone hearing a truth they'd already been afraid of. "I didn't want to believe that." "Believe it." Carter's voice was flat, controlled, the voice he used when he needed men twice his size to understand he wasn't asking. "Your sister doesn't run logistics like that on her own. She's smart, but not that smart. Someone planned the timing. Someone made sure it happened the exact hour I'd have no reason to expect it." Chloe's arms wrapped around herself, the empty ring box still trapped between her fingers like she'd forgotten it was there. "So what happens to me now?" It was the right question. In this business, people who were no longer useful had a way of becoming problems, and problems in the Vance world didn't usually get second chances. Carter could see her waiting for it, waiting for him to decide what kind of night this was going to be. Instead, he walked to the intercom panel by the door and pressed it without hesitation. "Lock the penthouse floor. Nobody comes up. Nobody goes down. I want 2 men outside this door within the minute." Chloe blinked at him, startled. "You're locking it down? For me?" "You didn't do this," Carter said simply. And until I know exactly who's out for blood tonight, you're safer in this building than anywhere else in the city." He paused, studying her face again, the fear slowly giving way to something more careful, more alert. "Your father used you as a distraction. I'm not interested in finishing what he started." For the first time since he'd walked in, Chloe's shoulders eased down from around her ears, just slightly. She looked at him like she wasn't quite sure whether to trust the calm in his voice, but she didn't argue either. Outside, the city lights blinked on undisturbed, oblivious to the quiet war that had just begun 30 floors above them. Somewhere out there, Audrey was running with secrets that could unravel everything Carter had built. And standing in front of him, trembling but refusing to break, was the one person nobody had planned on him actually protecting. Carter didn't know it yet, but the wrong sister had just become the only person in this city he could trust. By morning, Carter had already moved her. The penthouse wasn't safe anymore, not with half his own lieutenants asking questions about why the Miller girl was still breathing under his roof. So before sunrise, an armored SUV carried Chloe north along the lake, past the city limits, to an estate tucked behind iron gates in Evanston. It was quieter here. Guards walked the tree line instead of hallways, and the water stretched out grey and endless behind the house, hiding everything and giving away nothing. Chloe hadn't slept. She sat curled into the corner of a leather chair in the study, still wearing yesterday's clothes, watching the door like it might open on its own and swallow her whole. Carter found her there just after 7, a folder tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable in the way it always was when he hadn't decided how a conversation was going to go yet. "You should eat something," he said. "I'm not hungry." "You will be." He set the folder on the table between them anyway and sat across from her, elbows braced on his knees. "I need you to walk me through your father's business. Not the polite version he gives at dinner, the real one." Chloe's fingers curled into the sleeve of her sweater. "Why me? Audrey handled the books. I was never allowed near any of it." "Because Audrey's gone, and you're the only Miller left in this house." Carter's voice wasn't unkind, but it left no room to hide. "I think you know more than you've been given credit for. I think everyone in your family made sure of that on purpose." For a long moment, Chloe said nothing. Then, slowly, like she was testing whether the floor beneath her was actually solid, she reached for the folder and opened it. "This isn't the real ledger," she said after scanning the first page. "This is a version made to look complete. See here," she tapped a column of numbers. "These transfers loop back to the same 3 shell accounts every quarter. Audrey wouldn't have noticed that. She never looked past the summary pages. But I used to help our father organize his files when I was a teenager, back when nobody thought it mattered what I saw, because nobody thought I'd ever be smart enough to use it." Carter leaned forward slightly. "Keep going." Over the next hour, something shifted in the room. Chloe stopped flinching every time he moved and started talking faster, her voice gaining a kind of quiet confidence Carter hadn't expected from the trembling woman he'd found on his balcony the night before. She asked for a laptop, and when one of his men brought it, she typed with the ease of someone who'd spent years quietly teaching herself things nobody else in her family bothered to notice. "Your ledgers weren't stolen randomly," she said, turning the screen toward him. "Look at the timestamps. Someone accessed this specific folder 3 times over the last 2 months, always right before a syndicate meeting. That's not Audrey being clever on her own. That's someone feeding her exactly what to take and when." Carter's eyes narrowed at the screen. "Your father?" "I think so." Chloe's voice wavered, but she pushed through it. "He's been positioning this for a while. The wedding wasn't really about peace between our families. I think it was cover. A reason for Audrey to be inside your operation long enough to copy everything, and a reason for everyone to be looking at her, not him." It made a brutal kind of sense. A merger built on trust, timed perfectly to hollow him out from the inside, while the entire syndicate world watched a wedding instead of a robbery. Carter sat back, jaw tight, turning the pieces over in his mind. "If you're right," he said, "your father just declared war on both families at once. Yours and mine." "I know." Chloe's hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't fear alone. It was the particular exhaustion of finally saying something out loud that she'd been too afraid to admit even to herself. I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't the smart one, that Audrey was the one who mattered, and I was just... She stopped, shook her head. It doesn't matter what I was. I just never thought I'd be the one sitting here telling you your bride's father is a thief. Carter watched her for a long moment, something in his expression softening just slightly, though his voice stayed even. You just found something 3 of my best financial men missed in 12 hours. That's not nothing, Chloe. She looked up at him, startled by the use of her name instead of Miss Miller or the sister, the way his men had been referring to her since she arrived. I'm not going to pretend I know what happens next, Carter continued. But you're not a hostage here, and you're not a distraction anymore either. You just became the only person who can tell me what your family is actually planning. Outside, the lake caught the early light, calm and indifferent to the quiet storm building inside the house. Chloe looked down at the ledger again, at the numbers that had just turned her whole family inside out, and for the first time since the penthouse, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something bad to happen to her. She felt, strangely, like she was finally being seen. There's more, she said quietly, scrolling further down the file. If he's been skimming from both sides for this long, he's not just trying to profit off the wedding falling apart. He's protecting something bigger, something he doesn't want either family finding. Carter's eyes met hers, sharp and focused now, in a way that made the air in the room feel different. Then we're going to find it before he does, he said. Together. 2 days later, Carter brought Chloe into the loop, into the one place in the city he trusted more than his own home, a private vault 3 levels beneath an unmarked office tower, accessible only by biometric locks and a short list of names that hadn't changed in a decade. He told his men it was an audit. That was the story they'd stick to. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He needed Chloe's eyes on records nobody outside his inner circle had ever seen. She stood in the center of the vault room, staring at the wall of server drives like she'd stepped into a museum instead of a bank. This is everything, Carter said, watching her reaction. Every account, every property, every dollar the Vance family has moved in the last 20 years. If your father's hiding something inside our system, it's buried in here. Chloe exhaled slowly. That's a lot of trust for someone you met 2 days ago. I don't have the luxury of slow trust right now. Carter pulled out a chair for her at the terminal. I have the fastest instinct I've got, and it's telling me to use it. She sat, cracked her knuckles out of habit, and got to work. The first hour was quiet, filled only with the sound of keys and the occasional soft curse under her breath when a firewall pushed back harder than she expected. Carter stayed close, arms crossed, watching her work with a kind of fascination he wasn't used to feeling around anyone in this line of business. She wasn't performing for him. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply doing the thing she'd apparently been quietly good at her entire life, unnoticed, unrewarded, until now. Got it, she said suddenly, sitting up straighter. There's a secondary account structure buried under one of your logistics subsidiaries. It's dressed up to look like routine maintenance costs, but the pattern doesn't match anything else in your books. Carter leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. That's not one of ours. No, Chloe said. It's my father's. He's been skimming from your side for at least 3 years, funneled through fake maintenance invoices, then laundered right back out through Miller-owned shipping fronts. It's small enough each time that nobody flags it. But over 3 years, she pulled up a running total, and Carter's expression darkened as the number climbed into 7 figures. He's been robbing me blind, Carter said, using paperwork I signed off on myself. He's been robbing both families, Chloe corrected quietly. I found matching entries in the Miller books last night, before we left the manor. He's been skimming from his own people too. Small amounts, spread out, hidden behind expenses nobody double-checks. I don't think this was ever about the wedding, Carter. I think the wedding was just the easiest way to buy himself more time before someone noticed the money was gone. Carter straightened, jaw working as he processed it. Then, from the doorway behind them, a voice cut through the quiet. You're letting a Miller inside our vault. Marcus, Carter's second-in-command, stood with his arms folded, eyes fixed on Chloe like she was something that had wandered in off the street uninvited. He'd been with Carter since the beginning, loyal to a fault, but never one to keep his suspicions quiet. "She's the reason we know her father's been stealing from us for 3 years," Carter said evenly, not bothering to soften the edge in his voice. "Without her, we'd still be blaming Audrey and chasing the wrong thief. She's still a Miller." "She's still standing here helping me instead of running," Carter said, stepping slightly in front of Chloe without quite meaning to. "That matters more to me right now than her last name." Marcus held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a short nod and left without another word, though the tension he left behind lingered in the room like smoke. Chloe let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You didn't have to do that." "I meant it." Carter's voice softened just slightly as he sat back down beside her. "You've spent your whole life being underestimated by people who should have known better. I'm not going to be one more person who does that to you." Something in Chloe's chest loosened at the words, an ache she hadn't let herself name settling into something quieter. She turned back to the screen instead of answering, partly because she didn't trust her voice, and partly because there was still work to do. "If he's been stealing for this long," she said, "he's not going to stop just because Audrey ran. He'll need this money soon, especially if he's planning something bigger with the ledgers she took." "Then we follow the money," Carter said. "Every transfer, every shell account. If he's moving funds to prepare for something, it'll show up somewhere in these records." Chloe nodded, already pulling up a new set of files, fingers moving fast across the keyboard. For the first time since the night on the balcony, she didn't feel like a hostage being kept out of harm's way. She felt like a partner, sitting shoulder to shoulder with a man who trusted her instincts more than the family she'd spent her whole life trying to please. Outside the vault, 3 floors above them, the city moved on without any idea that somewhere beneath its streets, a stolen fortune and a broken family's secrets were slowly being pulled apart, one line of code at a time. They moved again that night, this time to a quiet house in Oak Park, with nothing about it that would draw attention. No cameras on the gate, no guards pacing outside, just a modest brick home on a tree-lined street where nobody would think to look for the head of the Vance syndicate or the daughter of a man he was quietly hunting. Chloe stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Carter check the perimeter through a gap in the curtains, and for the first time in days, the silence between them didn't feel like danger. It felt almost normal, the kind of quiet that came with 2 people finally allowed to breathe. "You don't have to keep checking," she said. "Nobody followed us." "Habit," Carter admitted, letting the curtain fall back into place. He crossed the room and dropped into the chair across from her at the small kitchen table, looking, for once, less like a man running an empire and more like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. "Old habits keep people alive in my line of work." Chloe wrapped both hands around the mug of tea one of his men had left for her, staring into it instead of at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why does any of this matter to you? Me being smart, me being useful. You could have handed me off to your men the first night and none of this would be your problem." Carter studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because you didn't ask me to save you. You just started working the problem the second I gave you the chance." He paused. "That's rare. Most people freeze when their whole world falls apart. You didn't." Chloe let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "I've had a lot of practice being invisible. When you spend your whole life watching everyone else get the attention, you learn to survive without needing it." "Tell me," Carter said, quieter now. "What was it like, growing up in that house?" She hesitated, turning the mug slowly between her palms. "Audrey was the beautiful one, the clever one," everyone said, even though I was always the one actually doing the work behind the scenes. She got the attention at dinners, the introductions to my father's associates, the dresses picked out months in advance for every event. I got left in the study with the account books because nobody thought I'd embarrass the family by being seen. Her voice cracked slightly. "My father used to say I should be grateful I had a mind for numbers, since I clearly wasn't going to get anywhere on looks alone." Carter's jaw tightened, something sharp flashing behind his eyes. "He said that to you?" "More than once." Chloe shrugged like it didn't matter, though the tightness in her shoulders said otherwise. I stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. It was easier that way. You don't get hurt by people who never had your respect to begin with. That's not something you should have had to learn, Carter said. Not from your own father. Chloe looked up at him, surprised by the quiet anger in his voice. Not performative, not for show, but real, like her father's cruelty genuinely offended something in him. Nobody had ever gotten angry on her behalf before. Not like that. You keep saying things like that, she said softly, like you actually mean them. I do mean them. Carter leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes steady on hers. You've spent 4 days handing me evidence that saved my organization from a war I didn't see coming, all while your entire family was busy building a fortune on the assumption that nobody would ever value what you actually bring to a room. I've built my whole career reading people, Chloe. I know brilliance when I see it, and I've been watching you outthink professionals twice your age since the moment you sat down at that terminal. Her eyes stung, and she blinked hard, embarrassed by how much the words affected her. Careful, she said, trying for lightness even as her voice wavered. I might start believing you. Good, Carter said simply. You should. The moment stretched between them, quiet and unhurried in a way nothing had been since the night on the balcony. For the first time, Chloe let herself really look at him, not as the dangerous man her family had spent years warning her about, but as someone who'd spent 4 days protecting her, listening to her, treating her like her mind mattered more than her last name ever had. When this is over, she said carefully, whatever's left of my family, whatever mess my father's made, I don't think I can go back to being who I was before, invisible, underestimated. You won't have to, Carter said. Whatever happens with your father, you're not going back to that house. Not unless it's on your own terms. Chloe felt something in her chest loosen, a knot she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. Why does that matter to you so much? Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, just close enough that the gesture spoke louder than anything he could have said. Because for the first time in a long time, he said quietly, I'm not just protecting someone because it's strategically smart. I actually care what happens to you, Chloe, and that's new for me too. Outside, the quiet suburban street stayed still and unaware, while inside the small brick house, something neither of them had expected began quietly taking root. Something that had nothing to do with ledgers or syndicates or the war still waiting for them beyond these walls. The lead came through just after midnight, a shipping manifest buried inside the falsified maintenance accounts Chloe had flagged days earlier, routing an unusually large freight container through a rail yard outside Joliet under a name neither of them recognized. Carter read the file twice before he understood what he was looking at. This isn't cargo, he said, sliding the tablet across to Chloe. This is a transfer point. Whatever your father's moving, it's changing hands tomorrow night. Chloe scanned the manifest, her eyes narrowing at a string of numbers buried in the shipping code. These aren't goods. This is a currency routing sequence disguised as a freight ID. He's using the rail yard to launder the last of what he's stolen before someone traces it back to him. Then we're going to be there when he tries. She looked up at him sharply. You're not going alone. Chloe. I decrypted this, she said, cutting him off before he could finish. I know the sequence. I know what to look for the second those manifests update in real time. You need me in that vehicle, not sitting in a safe house waiting for a phone call telling you whether you made it out. Carter studied her for a long moment, torn between the instinct to keep her as far from danger as possible and the growing certainty that she was right. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. She'd earned her place at the table, and he wasn't about to pretend otherwise now that the stakes were highest. Armored transport, he said finally. You stay inside the vehicle the entire time, no exceptions. Deal. The rail yard at night was a maze of steel and shadow, freight containers stacked in uneven rows under sodium lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Carter's men positioned themselves along the perimeter, quiet and unseen, while Carter and Chloe sat in the back of an armored SUV parked just outside the yard's north gate, a laptop balanced between them, showing live shipping data feeding in from the terminal system. "There," Chloe said suddenly, pointing at a container number flashing on the screen. "That's it. Track 7, second row. The manifest just updated with a false destination code. Someone's about to move it." Carter relayed the location through his earpiece, and within seconds, 2 of his men were moving through the rows of containers, silent and precise. Chloe's hands hovered over the keyboard, tracking the digital trail in real time, watching numbers shift as someone on the other end scrambled to reroute the shipment the moment they realized something was wrong. "They know," she said, voice tight. "The manifest just changed again. They're trying to redirect it to a different exit before your men reach it." "Can you stop it?" "I can try." Her fingers flew across the keys, running the counter-sequence she'd built days earlier back at the vault, a program designed to freeze exactly this kind of last-minute reroute. For a tense moment, nothing happened, the screen frozen mid-transfer while Carter watched her work with quiet, focused intensity. Then, the manifest locked. "Got it," Chloe breathed. "The container's stuck at its current location. They can't move it without physically overriding the system now, and that'll take time they don't have." Through the earpiece, Carter heard confirmation. His men had reached track 7. The container doors were forced open under floodlight, revealing not weapons, not bodies, but rows of sealed crates packed with cash and a hard drive taped inside a false panel in the container wall. No violence, no bloodshed, just the quiet, decisive end of a scheme that had been building for years, stopped cold by 2 people who'd been underestimated by everyone who should have known better. Chloe let out a shaky breath, sitting back against the seat as the tension finally drained out of her shoulders. "We actually did it." "You did it," Carter said, watching her with something warm and unguarded in his expression. "That program you built saved this entire operation. My best financial team couldn't have pulled that off in time." "I couldn't have found the shipment without your men," she said. "It wasn't just me." "No," Carter agreed. "It was both of us. That's exactly the point." Outside, his men secured the container and began the slow process of documenting everything inside, evidence that would strip her father of his last resources before he even realized what had happened. Somewhere in the city, Carter knew, her father was probably still waiting for confirmation the shipment had gone through clean. That confirmation was never going to come. Chloe watched the activity through the tinted window, a strange mixture of relief and grief settling over her. Relief, because the danger tonight had passed without a single person getting hurt. Grief, because every piece of evidence they uncovered made it harder to deny what her father truly was. "He's going to know it was me," she said quietly. "Once he realizes his shipment's gone, he'll know exactly who helped stop it." "Let him know," Carter said, his voice steady, protective. "You're not hiding anymore, Chloe. Not from him, not from anyone. Whatever he does next, he's not doing it without going through me first." She turned to look at him, and for a moment, the rail yard and the danger and the entire tangled mess of her family faded into the background. What remained was simpler, a quiet certainty that somewhere between the penthouse balcony and this armored vehicle, she'd stopped being someone's afterthought and started being someone Carter Vance trusted with everything that mattered most. The SUV pulled away from the yard as dawn began creeping over the horizon, carrying them both one step closer to a confrontation neither of them could avoid much longer. They crossed state lines 2 days later, setting up in a quiet hotel suite in Milwaukee under names that belonged to neither of them. Carter called it a precaution. Chloe suspected it was also something else. A chance to breathe somewhere that didn't carry the weight of Chicago's shadows pressing in from every direction. The suite overlooked the lake, grey and restless under a cloudy sky, and for the first morning since the penthouse, there was no immediate crisis waiting at the door. Chloe sat cross-legged on the couch with her laptop, sifting through the last of the files pulled from the rail yard container, while Carter worked quietly at the desk across the room, occasionally glancing over at her like he still hadn't quite gotten used to having her there. "Found something," Chloe said around mid-morning, sitting up straighter.
This isn't just about the money anymore. Carter crossed the room and leaned over her shoulder.
What is it? Communication logs. Encrypted, but I've seen this pattern before. It's the same coding structure my father used on the accounts. Someone's been in contact with a buyer overseas. A serious one. She scrolled through the decoded messages, her expression darkening with every line. Audrey's not just running with the ledgers anymore. She's trying to sell the master encryption key. Whoever gets that key gets access to every account you have, every hidden asset, everything. It's not theft at this point. It's the end of your entire operation if it goes through. Carter's face went still. The kind of stillness Chloe had learned meant he was doing rapid, dangerous math behind his eyes. When? Soon. The last message mentions a location and a window of only a few days. Chloe turned the screen toward him. If she sells that key, there's no version of this where you recover from it. You'd be finished. Then we stop her before she gets the chance. We will. Chloe closed the laptop gently, some of the earlier urgency softening into something quieter as she looked at him. But Carter, you should know, I've spent the last week helping you dismantle everything my family built. My father's fortune, his reputation, and now possibly my sister's freedom too. I keep waiting to feel guilty about that, and I don't. I think that scares me more than anything else has this whole week. Carter sat down across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. Why would that scare you? Because it means I've already let go of them, she admitted. Somewhere between the penthouse and here, I stopped thinking of them as family I'm protecting and started thinking of them as people who need to be stopped. That's not supposed to happen this fast. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, Carter said quietly. And it's not disloyalty to see people clearly, even when they're your own blood, especially when they're your own blood. Chloe looked at him for a long moment, something in her chest loosening at the simple honesty in his voice. You've said things like that to me all week. Things nobody in my family ever bothered to say. Maybe your family never noticed what they had, Carter said. Their loss. The words hung in the quiet room, warmer than either of them expected. Chloe felt her breath catch, and when she looked up, Carter was already watching her, something unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there in the beginning. Not calculation, not strategy, just quiet certainty. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to know I'm not saying it because of anything we've found this week. Not the ledgers, not the money, none of it. Okay, Chloe said softly. I didn't expect any of this, Carter admitted. The wedding was supposed to be a transaction, a truce dressed up in white lace, nothing more. I walked into that penthouse expecting to marry a stranger for the sake of peace between two families who never trusted each other anyway. He paused, his eyes steady on hers. Instead, I found you. And somewhere over the last week, this stopped being about protecting a witness or securing evidence. It became about you, Chloe, just you. Her eyes stung, and this time she didn't bother blinking it back. I've spent my whole life being the one nobody chose first, she said, voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to do with someone actually choosing me. You don't have to know yet, Carter said gently. You just have to let it be true. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, his hand settled over hers, warm and steady. The distance between them closed by inches, unhurried, until there was nothing left but quiet understanding between two people who'd found something neither of them had gone looking for. Whatever happens with Audrey, Carter murmured, whatever's left of your family when this is over, I want you to know none of that changes what I feel right now. Chloe let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her chest for days, maybe years. Then let's finish this, she said. Let's stop her before she destroys what's left of both our families. And then we figure out what comes next, Carter finished. Together. Outside, the lake stretched grey and endless toward the horizon, indifferent to the quiet promise settling between them. Somewhere out there, Audrey was still moving, still one step ahead, still holding the one piece of leverage that could unravel everything Carter had spent his life building. But for the first time all week, Neither of them felt like they were facing it alone. The location came through the following night, a private marina in Kenosha, tucked along the Wisconsin shoreline where the buyer's yacht was scheduled to dock under cover of darkness. Chloe traced the final message thread back to a slip number and a departure window barely 6 hours away, which left almost no time to plan and even less room for mistakes. "If we move too fast, she'll bolt," Carter said, pacing the length of the hotel suite, while Chloe finalized the last details of her counterprogram. "If we move too slow, that key changes hands and there's no getting it back." "Then we don't confront her at all," Chloe said. "Not directly." Carter stopped pacing. "Explain." "The buyer's the real risk here. If we go after Audrey directly, she'll panic and hand it over just to have leverage against you. But if we cut the buyer out first..." Chloe turned her laptop toward him, pulling up a financial map she'd built from the intercepted communications. "I can freeze his offshore accounts remotely the second the exchange is supposed to happen. No money, no deal. He walks away, and Audrey's left standing there with something worth nothing to her without a buyer." Carter studied the plan for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his face. "No confrontation, no violence. Just cut the legs out from under the whole transaction." "Exactly," Chloe said. "Nobody gets hurt. We just make sure the sale never happens." They arrived at the marina just before midnight, parked in an unmarked monitoring vehicle 200 yards from the dock where Carter's men had already quietly secured the surrounding perimeter. Through a long-lens camera, Carter watched the yacht ease into its slip, running lights dimmed low, while Chloe sat beside him with her laptop open, eyes locked on the live financial feed, tracking the buyer's accounts in real time. "There," she whispered, spotting Audrey's figure step off the dock and onto the boat, a slim black case held tightly against her side. "That's the key. She's early." Carter's jaw tightened at the sight of her, the woman he'd been supposed to marry, now standing on a stranger's yacht trying to sell away his entire empire without a flicker of hesitation. "Wait for my signal," he murmured to his men through the earpiece. "Nobody moves until the accounts freeze." On screen, Chloe watched the transaction begin to process, numbers shifting as the buyer's financial team initiated the transfer that would complete the sale. Her fingers moved fast, running the counter-program she'd built days earlier in Milwaukee, timing the freeze to hit the exact moment funds attempted to leave the account. "Now," she said. The transfer failed instantly, red error codes flooding the buyer's terminal, visible through the yacht's cabin window. Even from 200 yards away, Carter could see the sudden scramble aboard the boat, raised voices, a man in a dark suit gesturing furiously at a laptop screen that refused to cooperate. "His accounts are locked," Chloe confirmed, watching the data feed. "Every one of them. He can't complete the exchange even if he wanted to." Through the long lens, Carter watched the buyer turn on Audrey, sharp words exchanged that they couldn't hear but didn't need to. Whatever promises Audrey had made him about the value of that key meant nothing now that the money to pay for it had simply vanished. Within minutes, the yacht's engines fired up, and the buyer's men were already pulling the gangway back, abandoning the deal, and Audrey without a second glance. "He's leaving her," Carter said quietly, lowering the camera. Chloe watched the scene unfold, something complicated moving across her face. Not satisfaction exactly, but not grief either. Something closer to the strange, hollow relief of watching a person finally face the consequences of choices they'd been avoiding for years. "She's stranded," she said. "No buyer, no protection, and everyone in that marina just watched her get abandoned like she was worthless the second the money disappeared." "Do you want to go to her?" Carter asked, watching her carefully. Chloe considered it for a long moment, staring at the dock where her sister now stood alone under the harbor lights, the black case still clutched uselessly in her hands. "No," she said finally. "Not yet. She made her choice the night she left me standing in that penthouse. I'm not ready to pretend that didn't happen." Carter nodded, respecting the boundary without pushing. "Then we let her sit with it. My men will make sure she doesn't disappear again, but we don't need to force anything tonight." Chloe closed her laptop slowly, the tension of the last few hours finally beginning to drain out of her shoulders. "We actually did it," she said. "No confrontation, no bloodshed. We just took away the one thing that made her dangerous." "You did that," Carter said. "That program, that plan, all you." "We did it," Chloe corrected softly, echoing the words he'd given her back at the rail yard. "That's how this works now, remember?" Something warm passed between them in the quiet of the vehicle, a shared understanding that went beyond strategy or survival. Outside, the marina slowly emptied as Carter's men moved in to secure the black case and quietly detain Audrey without a single raised voice. The entire operation ending not in violence, but in the simple, decisive collapse of a plan that had been built on underestimating exactly the wrong person. As the vehicle pulled away from the dock, Chloe leaned her head back against the seat, exhausted but lighter than she'd felt in years. The key was secure, the buyer was gone, and somewhere behind them, her sister was finally facing the reality that the family's carefully built house of cards had just come crashing down. Brought low not by violence, but by the quiet brilliance of the very sister nobody had ever bothered to notice. The council meeting had been called for River North 3 days later, gathering every regional leader who mattered in a room panelled with dark wood and old money, the kind of place where reputations were built or destroyed in a single afternoon. Carter had requested it personally, which alone was enough to draw every eye in the room the moment he walked through the doors with Chloe at his side. Whispers followed them down the length of the long table. Nobody expected the sister of the woman who'd fled with Vance's most sensitive records to be standing beside him now, calm and composed, a leather folder held steady in her hands instead of trembling the way she had that first night on the balcony. "You've all heard some version of what happened," Carter said, taking his place at the head of the table while the room settled into uneasy silence. A wedding, a theft, a betrayal that nearly cost this alliance everything it was supposed to protect. "I'm not here to give you rumors. I'm here to give you proof." He nodded to Chloe, and she stepped forward, opening the folder without a hint of hesitation, though her heart was pounding harder than she let show. This was the room her father had spent years trying to gain respect in, the room that had never once bothered to learn her name. Today, she was the one holding every card that mattered. "My name is Chloe Miller," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of every gaze in the room. "For the last 3 years, my father has been systematically stealing from both the Vance Syndicate and his own organization, using falsified maintenance accounts and shell shipping fronts to hide the money. The wedding between my sister and Carter Vance wasn't a peace offering. It was cover, a way to get close enough to steal the encrypted ledgers that would have let him erase every trace of what he'd done, while framing Carter for illegal trade in the process." A ripple of tension moved through the room. One of the older council members, a heavy-set man named Delacroix, who'd known Chloe's father for decades, leaned forward with a skeptical frown. "That's a serious accusation from someone who's spent her whole life in her father's house. How do we know this isn't manipulation, a story built to protect Vance's interests?" Chloe didn't flinch. She turned the folder around and slid a set of printed documents down the table toward him. "Because I built the audit myself, using the raw account data, cross-referenced against shipping manifests from a container we intercepted in Joliet. Every transaction is time-stamped. Every shell account is traced back to an address registered under my father's private holding company. This isn't a story, Mr. Delacroix. It's math, and math doesn't lie, even when people do." The room fell quiet as council members passed the documents down the table, murmurs rising as they scanned page after page of undeniable evidence, years of theft laid bare in cold, precise detail. Chloe kept talking, walking them through the rail yard shipment, the failed sale at the marina, the buyer who'd abandoned Audrey the moment his money vanished, never once raising her voice, never once looking away from the men who'd spent her whole life deciding she didn't matter. Carter watched her from his seat, something fierce and quiet moving behind his eyes. He'd seen grown men fold under half this much scrutiny. Chloe stood in front of the most dangerous people in 3 states and dismantled her own father's empire without a single tremor in her voice. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a long moment before Delacroix set the documents down, his earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to grudging respect. "This is thorough work,"
he admitted. More thorough than anything my own people would have managed in the time you had. She built a counter-program that stopped an international sale of Vance's master encryption key in real time, Carter added, his voice carrying easily across the room. Without her, I'd be sitting in front of you today explaining how I lost this organization entirely, instead of standing here with proof of exactly who tried to take it from me. Murmurs of agreement moved through the table, the earlier suspicion toward Chloe softening into something new, recognition, maybe even a kind of respect nobody in her family had ever offered her. She'd walked into this room as an afterthought, the sister nobody planned for, and she was leaving it as the reason an entire syndicate war had been avoided. What happens to her father now? One of the younger council members asked. That, Carter said, is what we're here to decide. But I'll say this plainly. The evidence Chloe Miller uncovered saved every family at this table from a far worse outcome than a broken engagement. Whatever comes next for the Miller family, it happens because of the work she did, not in spite of it. Chloe closed her folder, her hands finally steady, and looked around the room at faces that had dismissed her existence a week ago and now watched her with something closer to wary admiration. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was real, and after a lifetime of being overlooked, real was more than she'd ever expected to get. As the council began deliberating the terms of her father's downfall, Carter reached over and gave her hand a brief, steadying squeeze under the table, a small gesture, invisible to the room, but it said everything neither of them needed to say out loud. She'd walked in as the wrong sister. She was walking out as the only one who'd ever truly mattered. The council's decision came fast once the evidence was laid bare. Full restitution, forfeiture of every account tied to the fraud, and a formal stripping of whatever standing William Miller had left among the families who'd once respected him. All that remained was delivering the terms in person, and Carter insisted Chloe be the one to do it. You don't have to come, he told her the morning they drove out to Naperville, the Miller family estate rising ahead of them behind familiar iron gates that had once felt like a cage and now felt strangely small. I want to, Chloe said, and she meant it. I spent my whole life in that house being told what I wasn't. I think I need to walk out of it one last time as exactly who I am. The study hadn't changed. Same dark shelves, same leather chairs, same portrait of her grandfather glaring down from above the fireplace like judgment made permanent. Her father sat behind his desk when they entered, older somehow than the man she remembered from a week ago, though only days had passed. News of the council's ruling had clearly reached him already. Chloe? His voice was careful, testing the ground. I didn't expect you to come. I imagine you didn't expect a lot of things, she said, setting the folder on his desk with a steadiness that surprised even her. Including the fact that I'm the one who found everything, Father. The shell accounts, the skimmed funds, the buyer you helped Audrey line up for the master key. All of it. Something flickered across his face, not quite surprise, more like the slow recognition of a man realizing he'd badly miscalculated the one daughter he'd never bothered to watch closely. You've always been clever with numbers, he said carefully. I never denied that. You denied everything else, Chloe said, her voice steady despite the tremor building beneath it. You denied I mattered. You denied I was worth introducing to your associates, worth dressing for the events that actually counted, worth anything beyond keeping your books quiet in a back room where nobody would see me. She placed her hands flat on the desk, leaning forward slightly. And then you used me as a distraction the night you needed one most, because you knew nobody would think twice about the daughter who never mattered. Her father's jaw tightened, but for the first time in her life, Chloe watched him struggle to find words that could actually defend what he'd done. There weren't any. The documents on the desk between them made sure of that. Carter stepped forward then, sliding the council's formal ruling across the desk. Your assets are frozen, effective immediately. Every account tied to the fraud reverts to the families you stole from. You'll retain your home and enough to live modestly, but your operational control ends today. The council was generous, given what you tried to do. William Miller's hands shook slightly as he scanned the pages, the full weight of his empire's collapse finally settling in. And Audrey? Being held pending the council's separate ruling on her involvement, Carter said flatly. That's not your concern anymore. Her father looked up then, not at Carter but at Chloe, something almost pleading in his expression. I made mistakes, but you're still my daughter. I was always your daughter, Chloe said quietly, something breaking loose in her chest as she finally said the words she'd swallowed her whole life. You just never treated me like one. You treated me like a resource, something useful to keep in the background until you needed to spend me on something. She straightened, her voice growing steadier with every word. I'm not spending myself on this family anymore, not on you, not on whatever's left of Audrey's choices. I'm done. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of papers as her father set the ruling down, finally, fully understanding there was nothing left to negotiate. Where will you go? He asked quietly. Chloe glanced at Carter, something warm passing between them, even in the middle of the tension still thick in the room. That's not something I owe you an answer to anymore, she said, but I'll tell you this much. For the first time in my life, I get to decide. She turned toward the door without waiting for a response, and Carter fell into step beside her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that felt less like protection now and more like quiet partnership. Behind them, her father remained seated at his desk, surrounded by the wreckage of an empire built on secrets, watching the daughter he'd never valued walk away as the only Miller left standing with any dignity at all. Outside, the late afternoon light spilled across the estate's manicured lawns, and Chloe paused at the top of the steps, looking back at the house one final time, not with grief, but with something closer to release. I used to think leaving this place would feel like losing something, she said softly. And now? Carter asked. Now it just feels like finally being free. She looked over at him, a small, genuine smile breaking through for the first time in days. Let's go home. With the Miller family stripped of power and the council's ruling settled, the weight that had pressed down on both of them for weeks finally began to lift. Carter didn't ask Chloe where she wanted to go once the dust cleared. He simply told his driver, Door County, and 3 hours later, they were standing on a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, the water stretching out in restless blue below a cottage tucked among the pines. This is yours? Chloe asked, taking in the wraparound porch, the wildflowers growing untamed along the path, the complete absence of guards or gates or anything resembling the world they'd just left behind. It is now, Carter said. I bought it years ago as a place to disappear when the city got to be too much. I've never actually stayed here longer than a night. He glanced at her, something almost shy in his expression, unusual for a man who commanded rooms without effort. I thought it was time it earned its purpose. They spent the first 2 days doing almost nothing, walking the shoreline, cooking simple meals in the small kitchen, sitting on the porch until the sky turned every shade of orange and purple before settling into full dark. For the first time since the penthouse, Chloe let herself stop bracing for the next crisis. There was no ledger to decrypt, no shipment to intercept, no counsel waiting to judge her worth. There was only the quiet, and Carter beside her in it. On the third morning, she found him at the kitchen table with a folder she didn't recognize, his expression unreadable in the way it had been that very first night, though there was nothing tense in the room now. What's this? She asked, sitting across from him. Paperwork, Carter said, sliding it toward her. For an independent auditing firm, fully licensed, fully funded, no ties to the Vance Syndicate or anything connected to it. It's registered under your name alone. Chloe stared at the documents, her breath catching as she flipped through pages that made no sense, yet somehow explained everything. Articles of incorporation, a client roster already partially built, office space secured in the loop under Chloe Miller, sole proprietor. I don't understand, she said softly. You spent your whole life being told your mind wasn't worth anything beyond keeping someone else's secrets, Carter said. I wanted you to have something that was entirely yours, not mine, not your father's, not tied to anyone's protection or approval, just yours, built on the thing you're actually brilliant at. Carter, this is... She shook her head, searching for words that felt too small. This is too much. It's not a gift with strings, he said, leaning forward. I'm not asking for anything in return, and I'm not trying to keep you close by making you dependent on me. If anything, I want the opposite. I want you to know you never have to stay anywhere you don't choose to be. Not with your family, and not with me either, unless it's what you actually want. Something in Chloe's chest ached at the quiet honesty in his voice, the complete absence of any expectation behind the offer. Every person in her life had wanted something from her. Her father, her sister, even the family name itself had demanded things of her without ever giving anything back. Carter was handing her freedom without asking for a single thing in exchange. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, echoing the question she'd asked him weeks ago in a different kitchen, in a different life. "Because I fell for a woman who built herself out of nothing but her own mind and her own resilience, even when everyone around her tried to convince her she wasn't worth investing in," Carter said simply. "I don't want to be one more person who only sees your value in what you can do for me. I want you to have something that's proof you never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who you already are." Chloe closed the folder slowly, her eyes glistening, and for a long moment she didn't trust herself to speak. When she finally did, her voice was quiet but steady. "I've spent my whole life waiting for someone to choose me. I never expected the person who finally did would also be the one who taught me I didn't need choosing to know my own worth." "You always knew it," Carter said gently. "You just needed someone to stop drowning it out long enough for you to hear yourself." She reached across the table, and this time it was her hand that found his, fingers lacing together with quiet certainty. Outside, the lake shimmered under the late morning sun, endless and calm, nothing like the storm that had brought them together weeks earlier. "I want to build this firm," Chloe said. "Not because I'm running from anything anymore, because for the first time I actually get to choose what I build my life around." "Then build it," Carter said, "and know that whatever you choose, I'll be here. Not because you need protecting anymore, because I want to be." They stayed at the cliff retreat 3 more days, the folder sitting on the kitchen table as a quiet promise of the life waiting for them beyond these walls, a life neither of them had planned for, built instead from a betrayal that should have ended everything, and somehow, against every expectation, had given them exactly what they never knew they were missing. On their last evening, standing together on the bluff as the sun dropped below the water, Chloe finally let herself believe that the wrong sister had turned out to be exactly the right one all along. 1 month after the papers were signed and the last of the Miller fortune redistributed among the families it had been stolen from, the Vance Estate Conservatory filled with warm light and quiet laughter. A celebration built on nothing but genuine choice this time. No forced contracts, no rival families circling for advantage, just people who actually wanted to be there. Chloe stood near the glass walls, watching the last of the evening sun filter through rows of orchids Carter's grandmother had apparently planted decades earlier, and thought about how different this felt from the night she'd stood on a penthouse balcony holding an empty ring box, certain her life was about to fall apart. It had fallen apart, and somehow, from the wreckage, something better had grown in its place. "You look like you're somewhere else," Carter said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne, his tie already loosened, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "I was just thinking about the balcony," Chloe admitted, accepting the glass. "How certain I was that night that everything good in my life had already happened without me, and I'd just missed it." "And now?" "Now I think that was the night everything actually started." She smiled, small and real. "Funny how that works." Across the conservatory, Marcus stood in quiet conversation with 2 of the council members who'd once questioned whether Chloe belonged anywhere near the Vance operation. He caught her eye briefly and gave a short nod. Not warmth exactly, but respect. Hard-earned and honest, which from a man like Marcus meant more than any polite compliment could have. "He still doesn't fully trust me," Chloe observed. "He doesn't fully trust anyone," Carter said.
But he stopped questioning whether you belong here weeks ago. That's as close to acceptance as Marcus gets. The firm had opened its doors 2 weeks earlier, small but already busy, 3 clients on the books entirely through word of mouth after the council quietly spread news of the audit that had exposed a syndicate-wide fraud without a single act of violence. Chloe had built a reputation in 1 month that her father had spent decades failing to earn honestly, and she'd done it without asking anyone's permission first. Word had also reached her about Audrey, a formal separation from the family, assets frozen, living quietly somewhere outside the city under terms the council had set to keep her from causing further damage. Chloe had felt the news land differently than she expected. Not triumph, not even relief exactly, just a settled kind of peace that came from finally closing a door that had been swinging open her entire life.
"Do you ever think about reaching out to her?" Carter asked, carefully, following the direction of her thoughts.
"Sometimes," Chloe admitted. "Maybe someday, when there's actually something left to say that isn't anger. But not yet. Maybe not for a long time." She looked up at him. "I'm allowed to take my time with that, aren't I?" "You're allowed to take your time with anything," Carter said. "That's the whole point of choosing your own life instead of having it chosen for you." Later, as the evening deepened and the conservatory lights dimmed to something softer, Carter led her toward the center of the room, where a small crowd of trusted associates had gathered, people who'd watched her over the past month build something real out of nothing, who'd stopped seeing her as the Miller sister and started seeing her simply as Chloe. Carter reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box, and for one disorienting second, Chloe's mind flashed back to the empty ring box she'd been holding the night they met, the symbol of a marriage that had never been meant for her at all. But when he opened it, there was no ring inside. Instead, a delicate crest, silver and engraved, the Vance family emblem redesigned with a subtle addition woven into its edges, a detail she recognized instantly as the symbol from her own independent firm's letterhead. "This isn't a replacement for anything that happened before," Carter said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. "This is a partner's crest. It means you stand beside me, not behind me, not because of any contract or arrangement, but because that's simply where you belong, where you've belonged since the night you refused to fall apart in front of me." Chloe's eyes filled as she took the crest from the box, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Not ownership, not obligation, but genuine partnership, freely given and freely accepted. "I spent my whole life being the sister nobody planned for," she said softly, looking up at him. "The one left behind, the one nobody thought mattered enough to matter." "And now?" Carter asked, echoing her words from earlier that evening. "Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Chloe said, "with exactly the people who see me for who I actually am." Around them, the small gathering raised their glasses, and Carter pulled her close, the conservatory glass reflecting the last soft light of evening, as 2 people who'd found each other through betrayal and broken plans finally stood together on their own terms, building a life neither of them had expected, but both of them had chosen, fully and completely, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide. Outside, the city lights of Lake Forest blinked on in the distance, indifferent to the quiet victory unfolding in the glass room above the gardens, a story that had begun with the wrong sister left behind and ended with exactly the right one found.